The static was a living thing. It hissed and crackled from the main speakers in the Tactical Operations Center, a sound like a nest of digital vipers. On the central holographic map, the 4 blue icons of Spectre Team were pinned, unmoving, inside a red polygon that pulsed with a sickening rhythm. The symbol for heavy enemy contact blinked over them, a frantic, silent scream. Outside the reinforced walls of the Al Dafra Air Base, the sky had turned a bruised shade of ochre. A haboob, a sandstorm of biblical proportions, was swallowing the desert whole, grounding everything with wings. 47 minutes since last coherent transmission, a communications tech announced, his voice tight, "They're reporting heavy armor moving on their position. Air support is a no-go. Zero visibility." Colonel Marcus Thorne stood before the map, his hands clasped behind his back, his posture as rigid as the steel beams holding up the roof. He was a man carved from regulations, his face a mask of controlled fury. Every pilot, every drone operator, every asset he had was grounded. The storm had rendered his billion-dollar Air Force inert. The 4 blue icons were a testament to his impotence, and he hated it. "What about the QRF?" Thorne demanded, his voice cutting through the static. "The ground convoy is trying to push through, sir," replied a major. "They're making 5 clicks an hour. They won't get there in time. Spectre is being systematically dismantled." The room was a pressure cooker of hushed conversations and the frantic clatter of keyboards. No one noticed the woman standing near the entryway, her flight suit a darker gray than the standard issue, her presence as quiet and unobtrusive as a shadow. Captain Eva Rostova watched the pulsing red polygon, her expression unreadable. She wasn't a pilot of this theater. She was a ferry pilot, a glorified courier who'd brought in a specialized piece of equipment and was waiting for a ride out. Her official file listed minimal combat hours, mostly in reconnaissance from a decade ago. To the hardened veterans of this air wing, she was just a transient officer, another cog in the vast machine. She slipped out of the TOC, the urgent voices fading behind her. She walked past the rows of gleaming F-35s and F-22s, their canopies covered, their engines silent and cold. They were apex predators neutered by dust. Her destination was Hangar 7, a forgotten corner of the base where the ghosts of old projects were left to gather dust of a more mundane sort. Inside, sitting alone under the weak yellow lights, was her aircraft. It had no official designation in the current inventory. The crews had nicknamed it the Strix. It was a single-seat, twin-engine craft, but its design was alien. The wings could sweep forward, not just back, and were lined with what looked like thousands of tiny, articulated feathers. The fuselage was flat, angular, and coated in a radar-absorbent material that seemed to drink the light. It looked less like a machine built for flight and more like a predator that had evolved for it. Eva walked a slow circle around it, her gloved hand running lightly along the leading edge of the wing. The metal was cool, alive with a latent energy. A young airman, Leo Vance, barely out of his teens, was polishing a sensor node on the nose cone. He was the only one assigned to the Strix, a dead-end job for a rookie. "Storm's a bad one, ma'am," he said, not looking up. "I've seen worse," Eva replied, her voice low and calm. She stopped at the cockpit ladder, her gaze fixed on the churning brown wall of sand visible through the open hangar doors. She could feel the pressure change in the air, a drop that signaled the storm's imminent arrival. The 4 blue icons on the map in the TOC burned in her mind. 47 minutes. Their clock was running out. Hers was just about to start. Eva walked back into the TOC, the automatic doors hissing shut behind her with a note of finality. She moved directly toward the command dais, her path cutting through the low-grade panic that had settled over the room. She stopped a respectful distance from Colonel Thorne, who was now staring at a satellite feed showing nothing but an impenetrable blanket of sand. "Sir," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had a quality that made several heads turn. It was clear, steady, and devoid of the frantic edge that laced everyone else's words. Thorne turned slowly, his eyes taking a moment to place her. "Captain Rostova, isn't it? The ferry pilot." What is it? Your transport is delayed. I'm afraid. As you can see, we have a situation. He gestured dismissively at the maelstrom on the screens. I can get to them, sir, Eva stated. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was a statement of fact. A ripple of incredulous silence spread from the dais. The major at Thorne's side actually coughed to cover a laugh. Thorne's eyebrows climbed his forehead. You can what? The Strix can handle those conditions, she said, her gaze unwavering. Its sensor suite is designed for zero-visibility particle-dense environments. The vectoring system can compensate for the wind shear. Thorne stared at her as if she'd just started speaking in tongues. Captain, you are a transport pilot with 50 hours of logged flight time in this hemisphere. None of it in combat. You are proposing to take an experimental, uncertified prototype, a museum piece your file calls an aerodynamic demonstrator, into a Category 5 Haboob to perform a close air support mission for a Tier 1 Special Forces unit. Is that an accurate summary of your request? It's not a request, sir. It's the only option you have, Eva said, her tone still perfectly level. The quiet audacity of her words hung in the air. The colonel's face hardened, his initial disbelief curdling into anger. He saw a rookie, an outsider, a woman with no grasp of the stakes trying to play hero. Let me be clear, Captain. This is not a training simulation. Spectre is a team of the most elite soldiers in the world. They are not a target for you to practice on. Your aircraft is a relic, a failed DARPA project that's been collecting dust for a decade. Whatever you think it can do, you are wrong. We will not risk $1 billion asset and a pilot on a suicide run. The answer is no. Now get off my bridge. You are dismissed. He turned his back on her, a clear signal that the conversation was over. The other officers in the room followed his lead, some with pity, others with open scorn. A hotshot pilot trying to make a name for herself. They'd seen it before. Eva stood there for a moment, the focus of their collective dismissal. Her face remained a blank slate. She gave a short, correct nod to the colonel's back, turned on her heel and walked out of the TOC. The hiss of the closing doors seemed to sigh with relief at her departure. She hadn't argued. She hadn't pleaded. She had presented a solution, and it had been rejected by a man who couldn't see past the ink on a page. The 4 blue icons continued to pulse. Their clock was still ticking. Eva didn't return to her temporary quarters. Her steps were measured and purposeful, leading her straight back to Hangar 7. The wind was howling now, a physical force that tore at the hangar's thin metal walls, making them groan and shudder. The air was thick with the taste of grit. Airman Vance was attempting to wrestle the massive hangar doors closed against the storm's onslaught. They said no, didn't they, ma'am? He grunted, putting his shoulder into the heavy door. Eva didn't answer. She walked to a storage locker and keyed in a code. Inside hung her flight gear. It was different from the standard issue suits. It was a single piece, charcoal gray, with a complex lattice of fine silver wires woven into the fabric. She pulled it on, the material molding to her form. The process was a ritual, each buckle and seal checked with practiced efficiency. She was shutting out the world, encasing herself in a second skin built for pressure and violence. Vance finally managed to dog the last latch on the doors, plunging the hangar into a world of muffled sound and dim, artificial light. The roar of the storm was now a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the concrete floor. He turned and saw her pulling on her helmet. It was an older model, its lines less sleek than the modern helmets, but it was scarred with the marks of hard use. Faded white stenciling on the back read, Rostova. Ma'am, Vance asked, his voice laced with a mixture of awe and fear. What are you doing? My pre-flight check, she said, her voice slightly tinny through the helmet's internal comms. She climbed the ladder and swung herself into the Strix's cockpit. It was a cramped space, dominated by a single wraparound display instead of a dozen smaller screens. There were no paper charts, no superfluous gauges, just pure, distilled information. On the left sleeve of her flight suit, just below the shoulder, was a single, unofficial patch. It was circular, embroidered with black thread on a field of gray. The image was a stylized owl, Its wings swept back as if in a dive, its eyes two piercing points of silver thread. It was worn, the edges frayed, a relic from another time. Eva's gloved fingers brushed over it for a fraction of a second, a gesture so fleeting Vance almost missed it. "You're really going?" he whispered, standing at the base of the ladder. Eva's hands moved over the console, her fingers dancing in a complex sequence. The cockpit came to life, not with a roar, but with a low thrum that seemed to emanate from the very air around them. The main screen flickered, displaying a topographical map overlaid with a swirling, chaotic weather simulation. "Run the external power disconnect," she ordered, her voice now crisp and authoritative. "And get clear of the bay doors." Vance hesitated for only a second. He saw the absolute certainty in her posture, the fusion of pilot and machine that was already taking place. This wasn't recklessness. It was purpose. He scrambled to the wall unit, his hands pulling the heavy levers that disconnected the hangar's power umbilical from the aircraft. The Strix's internal systems took over, the low thrum deepening in pitch. He sprinted to the far wall, taking cover behind a stack of spare parts crates. Eva's right hand rested on the throttle quadrant. Her left was on the control stick, its grip worn smooth from countless hours of use by hands other than her own. Through the thick, armored canopy, she could see the hangar doors vibrating, bowing inward under the immense pressure of the storm. She took a breath, held it, and then exhaled slowly. The world narrowed to the data on her screen, the feel of the controls, and the 4 blue icons that were about to be extinguished. The colonel had dismissed her. The storm had grounded an air force. But the Strix wasn't just an aircraft, and she wasn't just a pilot. The Strix's twin hybrid engines spooled up with a sound unlike any other jet. It was a high-frequency whine layered over a deep, guttural roar, a noise that spoke of barely controlled power. Eva didn't request clearance. She didn't announce her intentions. She toggled the comms not to the tower, but to the hangar door controls. A series of coded clicks and the massive doors, groaning in protest, began to slide open. A solid wall of sand and wind blasted into the hangar, a physical assault of grit and noise. Vance shielded his eyes, watching in disbelief as Eva pushed the throttles forward. The Strix rolled, not with a lumbering gait, but with the pounce of a predator. It shot out of the hangar and into the teeth of the haboob. In the TOC, a new icon blinked onto the airfield map. An unauthorized takeoff. "Who the hell is that?" Thorne bellowed, his face turning a shade of purple. "I want a name. I want them on a radio now." "It's the experimental craft from Hangar 7, sir," an air controller stammered. "No response on any channel. It just flew directly into the storm wall." Thorne's fists clenched. "That goddamned ferry pilot. She's going to get herself killed." He saw it as the ultimate act of insubordination, a foolish, suicidal gesture. For Eva, the world outside the cockpit ceased to exist. The moment she entered the storm, visibility dropped to absolute zero. The canopy was scoured by a billion tiny hammers of sand, the noise a deafening, continuous roar. To a standard pilot, this was unsurvivable. The wind shear alone could tear the wings off a conventional fighter. But the Strix was anything but conventional. Eva's eyes were locked on the main display. It was no longer a simple map. It was a three-dimensional rendering of the air around her, painted in shifting colors. The Strix's unique sensor suite wasn't using light or radar in the traditional sense. It was using a form of acoustic resonance and gravimetric distortion detection, building a picture of the world from pressure waves and microgravity fluctuations. The storm was not a barrier. It was a medium. She could see the pockets of extreme turbulence as areas of deep red, the stable airflows as cool blue channels. She wasn't flying through the storm. She was navigating its currents, like a submarine in the deep ocean. The airframe groaned under the strain. Alarms, which would have been screaming in any other aircraft, were silent, their warnings integrated directly into her haptic feedback gloves. She felt the pressure on the left wing as a specific vibration in her palm, correcting with a minute adjustment of the stick before the onboard computer even had to. Her lineage was not one of trackers or snipers, but of test pilots. Her grandfather had flown experimental rockets in the thin air of the stratosphere, and her father had been the one to first tame the machine she now commanded. They had taught her to listen to an airframe, to feel its stress in her own bones. She leveled off at 300 feet, a height that would have been suicidal for anyone else. She was under the enemy's main radar net, and inside the storm's electronic chaos, she was a ghost. Her target was the last known position of Spectre, but she knew the enemy would be hunting them, which meant they would have set up a screen. She needed to clear a path. Her sensors picked it up first, a rhythmic electronic pulse, faint but distinct. A targeting radar. They had an anti-aircraft battery positioned on a ridge, waiting for any rescue attempt foolish enough to fly in this weather. They never imagined someone could be flying inside it. The world inside Eva's cockpit was a torrent of sensory input, a symphony of chaos that she processed with preternatural calm. The Strix bucked and shuddered, not like a machine fighting the elements, but like a living creature navigating its natural habitat. The haptic feedback in her gloves and flight suit translated the storm's fury into a language she understood intimately. A sharp vibration in her left shoulder warned of a microvortex forming off the port wing. A gentle pressure on her right thigh indicated a stable updraft. She was reading the storm, her mind and the aircraft's esoteric systems fused into a single cognitive entity. In the TOC, they could only see a single, intermittent radar return. A ghost on the screen that appeared and vanished, swallowed by the immense clutter of the haboob. Colonel Thorne stared at it, his anger warring with a grudging, horrified fascination. "Is she still airborne?" he demanded, as if the blip itself were lying. "Affirmative, sir," the controller replied, his voice hushed. "She's maintaining an altitude of 300 feet. Ground speed is 400 knots. It shouldn't be possible." Eva ignored the impossibility of her situation. She was focused on the electronic signature of the ZU-23-2 anti-aircraft battery. Its radar was sweeping, a desperate attempt to pierce the sand and find a target. To her, that radar was a lighthouse beam in the fog. She adjusted her course, flying a corkscrew pattern that followed a channel of relatively stable air, bringing her in on the battery's flank. Her weapon systems were now online. The Strix carried a small but potent payload. She selected a single GBU-53/B Stormbreaker bomb. Its own multimode seeker was perfect for this. She didn't need to see the target. She only needed to give the bomb its last known coordinates and let it hunt. "Designating target," she murmured, her voice a low hum within her helmet. Her thumb moved on the control stick, slewing a targeting reticle over the pulsing electronic signature on her display. A solid green box locked onto the source. She was now less than 2 kilometers from the ridge. This was the most dangerous part. To get a clean release and allow the bomb's fins to deploy properly, she had to briefly exit the storm's main wall. It would expose her for a handful of seconds. The enemy gunners, even blinded by sand, would react to the sudden sound of her engines. She saw a momentary thinning in the particle density ahead, a transient gap in the storm. "Now," she breathed. She pushed the stick forward, diving the Strix out of the ochre ceiling. For precisely 47 seconds, the world transformed. The deafening roar of sand on the canopy was replaced by the shriek of the wind. She saw it all in a flash. A rocky ridgeline, the twin barrels of the ZU-23-2 silhouetted against the swirling dust, and the startled faces of the gun crew turning towards the impossible sound. Her thumb pressed the red button on the stick. Weapon away. A single Stormbreaker dropped from the belly of the Strix. As its fins deployed, Eva pulled back hard, rolling the aircraft onto its side and plunging back into the comforting blindness of the storm. The entire maneuver was a single, fluid motion, a predator striking from concealment and vanishing before its prey could react. In the TOC, a satellite feed that had been trying to penetrate the storm with thermal imaging suddenly registered a brilliant flash of white light on the ridgeline. The red icon marking the anti-aircraft battery blinked once, then vanished from the map. Silence descended on the command center. The communications tech lowered his headset. "Sir," Spectre lead just came through on a tight beam burst. He says an angel just cleared the sky. Thorn stared at the empty space on the map where the threat had been. His rigid posture sagged almost imperceptibly. The ferry pilot, the rookie, he had dismissed her, mocked her, and she had just done the impossible. His mind was reeling, a career's worth of tactical doctrine shattering against the reality of what he was witnessing. The ghost on his screen wasn't on a suicide run. She was on the hunt. The enemy was not stupid. The sudden, surgical elimination of their primary air defense battery sent a shockwave of panic and confusion through their ranks. But they adapted quickly. On the tactical map in the TOC, new icons began to appear. Mobile units, previously held in reserve, were now on the move, converging on Spectre's position and spreading out along the flight path the Strix would likely need to take. They were SAM's surface-to-air missiles, man-portable launchers, and vehicle-mounted systems. They couldn't get a solid radar lock in the storm, but they didn't need one. They started launching missiles on ballistic trajectories, firing into the storm clouds in a grid pattern, hoping to get lucky. Proximity fuses would do the rest. Inside the Strix, Eva's threat display lit up. She saw the launch plumes as thermal spikes, the missiles themselves as faint tracks on her gravimetric sensor. The sky, which had been her sanctuary, was now a minefield. A new voice crackled in her ear, cutting through the low hum of the cockpit. It was Colonel Thorn. His tone was utterly changed. The anger and condescension were gone, replaced by a clipped, focused urgency. "Callsign Nix, this is Overlord. Do you copy?" Eva's hands were busy, jinking the Strix left, then right, dropping altitude to skim the desert floor as a missile detonated 1,000 feet above her, the shockwave rattling the canopy. She keyed her mic, "Nix copies." The call sign felt strange on her tongue. It was old, one she hadn't used in years. A relic, like the patch on her sleeve. "We are tracking multiple mobile launchers," Thorn's voice continued, stripped of all emotion except a desperate need for her to succeed. "They are attempting to box you in. We have an intelligence intercept that suggests they are coordinating their launches based on your engine noise. They're listening for you." Eva processed this new information instantly. They were using acoustic triangulation, a primitive but potentially effective method in the storm's disorienting environment. She couldn't outrun them and she couldn't hide. She had to change the equation. "Acknowledged, Overlord," she replied, her voice steady. She pulled the Strix into a steep climb, punching through a turbulent layer of air. Another missile streaked past her starboard wing, close enough for her to see the brief flare of its rocket motor through the dense dust. "Nix, what is your intention?" Thorn asked, a hint of his old command authority returning, but it was tempered with a new, raw uncertainty. He was no longer giving orders. He was asking for clarification. He was a spectator to a form of aerial warfare he didn't understand. "Going quiet," was all Eva said. She reached forward and flipped a guarded switch on the console. The deep, guttural roar of the Strix's main engines died, replaced by an eerie, almost total silence. The high-frequency whine remained, but it was barely audible over the sound of the wind. The Strix was now flying on its secondary drive, a silent gravimetric lift system that provided maneuverability and altitude control but very little forward thrust. Her speed began to bleed off rapidly. She was a glider, a ghost, trading speed for stealth. In the TOC, the acoustic sensors that had been tracking her engine noise went dead. Her intermittent radar blip vanished completely. For a terrifying minute, Thorn and his entire crew believed she had been hit. "Nix, report." Thorn snapped, his voice cracking. No response. But Eva was busier than ever. She was now sailing on the storm's currents, using the violent updrafts to maintain altitude. Her unique forward-swept wings articulated like a hawk's, catching every nuance of the air. She was falling with style, a controlled descent through hell. The enemy SAM teams were now blind and deaf, firing randomly into the empty sky. She was using their own strategy against them, turning the storm from a threat into her primary weapon. Thorn, staring at a blank screen, had gone from furious dismissal to grudging reliance, and now to a state of absolute, terrified faith. He had handed the fate of his best men to a ghost, and all he could do was watch the empty map and wait for the thunder. The silence in the cockpit was a heavy blanket. Eva was no longer a pilot in the traditional sense. She was a sailor on an ocean of violent air. With her main engines offline, she was a whisper in the storm, but she was also losing speed and altitude with every passing second. The enemy SAM teams, confused by her sudden disappearance, had ceased their barrage, but they were still out there, listening. Ahead of her, the path to Spectre's extraction point was blocked by a jagged spine of mountains, a feature on the map labeled the Serpent's Tooth. It was a labyrinth of sheer rock walls and narrow, twisting canyons, a place where even helicopters flew with extreme caution in perfect weather. In these conditions, it was a tomb. Thorne's voice came over the comm again, strained. "Nix, telemetry shows your altitude dropping. You're headed directly for the Serpent's Tooth. That's a no-fly zone. Abort. I repeat, abort and re-engage engines." "Negative, Overlord." Eva's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. "Going through is the only way. They'll be listening for my engines on the approach. I can't give them a target." "Through? Captain, there is no through." The Major's voice cut in, panicked. "The passes are barely 50 meters wide in places. You can't navigate that blind." Eva didn't reply. Her full attention was on the three-dimensional battlespace rendered on her screen. The Strix's sensors were painting a high-fidelity image of the canyon system ahead, mapping every rock and crevice from the pressure waves bouncing off them. It was a wireframe ghost of a mountain, and she was about to fly into it. She pushed the stick forward, nosing the Strix into a steeper dive, trading altitude for precious airspeed. She entered the mouth of the main canyon like a needle being threaded. The moment she was below the canyon rim, the roaring wind abated, replaced by a treacherous, swirling vortex of currents. The walls of the canyon were so close she felt she could reach out and touch them. On her display, the rock faces were rendered in glowing red lines, proximity warnings that formed a claustrophobic cage around her. This was the ultimate test of both pilot and machine. The Strix's forward-swept wings, with their thousands of micro-articulated surfaces, were constantly adjusting, tasting the air, making thousands of calculations per second to keep her stable. Eva's inputs on the control stick were minimal, almost subconscious. A nudge here, a touch of rudder there. She wasn't fighting the turbulence. She was dancing with it. Her breath hitched in her throat as a sudden downdraft slammed the Strix downwards, the belly of the aircraft skimming scant feet above the jagged canyon floor. A shower of sparks erupted as a sensor pod scraped against rock, the screech of tortured metal a piercing shriek in the quiet cockpit. She was flying on instinct, on a lifetime of inherited knowledge. She remembered her father's words from years ago, sitting in the cockpit of this very prototype in a simulator. "Don't fly the plane, Evie. Let the plane fly you. Feel the air. Become part of the pressure, part of the flow." The canyon twisted, a sharp, hairpin turn that no conventional jet could have made at this speed. Eva deployed the Strix's canards and vectored the output from the gravimetric lifters, forcing the aircraft to pivot on its central axis. The maneuver exerted crushing G-forces, but her specialized flight suit constricted, keeping the blood in her head. For a moment, her view was nothing but a blur of a sandstone wall, so close she could see the individual strata in the rock. Then she was through. The canyon opened up into a small, bowl-shaped valley. In the center, she saw them. The 4 blue icons on her map resolved into the real thing. For operators, crouched behind a cluster of ruins, surrounded by the muzzle flashes of enemy fire. A PAVE-low helicopter was hovering a kilometer away, unable to approach the hot landing zone. Eva had arrived, and now the silence was over. She flipped the guard on the engine switch. The Strix's engines reignited with a deep, hungry roar that shook the very foundations of the canyon. The sound, amplified and distorted by the rock walls, was terrifying, inhuman. The enemy fighters, who had been focused on pinning down Spectre, jerked their heads up at the impossible noise. They saw a black, winged shape erupt from the canyon's throat, a demon born of sand and thunder. Eva's transition from silent glider to avenging angel was instantaneous. Before the enemy could even process what they were seeing, she was on them. Her target display lit up, painting the fortified machine gun nests on the valley rim in red diamonds. Overlord, Nyx is commencing gun run. Tell the Pave Low to get ready. They're ready, Nyx. Thorn's voice was tight with adrenaline. Godspeed. The Strix fell upon the first enemy position. A heavy machine gun dug into an ancient stone wall. Eva didn't use missiles. It was too close, too personal. She squeezed the trigger on the control stick, and the aircraft's 25mm cannon spun to life. It didn't bark. It ripped the air apart with a sound like tearing fabric. A stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds, brighter than magnesium in the storm-dimmed light, slammed into the emplacement. The stone wall disintegrated into dust and fire. The machine gun fell silent. She pulled the Strix up in a vertical climb that seemed to defy gravity, the unique engine configuration allowing her to hover for a moment, suspended between earth and sky like a hawk choosing its next target. She pivoted, the aircraft turning in its own length, and dived again. Another nest, this one protected by sandbags and timbers, was her target. This time, she fired a pair of small hypervelocity rockets. They struck with pinpoint accuracy, the resulting explosion collapsing the entire position into a crater of smoking debris. The enemy forces were in chaos. They had been on the verge of annihilating Spectre, and now they were being systematically dismantled by a single, terrifying aircraft that had appeared from nowhere. They threw everything they had at her. RPGs streaked through the air, heavy machine gun fire laced the sky, but Eva was a ghost. She used the canyon walls for cover, darting out for a devastatingly precise strike before vanishing back behind a rock spire. Her movements were unpredictable, her attacks coming from all directions at once. She was not just providing close air support, she was a one-woman apocalypse. With the primary threats neutralized, the Pave Low saw its chance. It surged forward, its rotors whipping up a vortex of sand as it settled into the landing zone. The ramp dropped. Spectre team, providing their own covering fire, broke for the helicopter. Go, go, go! Spectre lead yelled into his comms. But the enemy wasn't finished. A technical, a pickup truck with a heavy cannon mounted in the back, roared out from behind a rock formation, charging directly for the vulnerable helicopter. Eva saw it. She was in a tight turn, her energy low. She didn't have time for another pass. She did the one thing no pilot should ever do. She flew the Strix directly into the line of fire, positioning her aircraft between the Technical and the Pave Low. The Technical's cannon erupted, and a shell exploded against the Strix's belly. The impact a brutal, jarring blow that threw Eva against her straps. Alarms screamed, real ones this time. The port engine was hit, trailing black smoke. Ignoring the damage, ignoring the pain lancing through her shoulder, Eva rolled the wounded Strix and fired her cannon one last time. The stream of shells walked directly up the hood of the Technical and into the gunner's compartment. The truck swerved violently and exploded in a massive fireball. Spectre is on board, the Pave Low pilot yelled. We're lifting. Eva watched the helicopter climb away, its precious cargo secure. Her job was done. Now, she just had to get herself and her crippled bird home. The flight back was a battle in itself. The Strix flew awkwardly, listing to one side, the damaged port engine spewing smoke and threatening to flame out completely. Eva had to fight the controls every second, her muscles screaming in protest. The storm, which had been her ally, was now a relentless enemy, tearing at her wounded aircraft. She nursed the Strix through the churning chaos, her focus narrowed to a single point, the faint outline of the airbase on her navigation display. She broke through the storm wall a mile from the base. The Strix emerged from the ochre cloud like a creature crawling from its lair, battered, smoking, but miraculously intact. Every emergency vehicle on the base was racing towards the runway. She ignored the tower's frantic calls, lining up on the main landing strip. The landing gear deployed with a sickening crunch. She touched down hard, the tires screaming in protest, and fought the rudder to keep the unbalanced aircraft from veering off the runway. The Strix skidded to a halt at the far end of the tarmac, finally silent save for the ticking of cooling metal and the hiss of fire-retardant foam from the emergency crews that now surrounded it. Eva went through the shutdown sequence on muscle memory alone. When the canopy hissed open, the sudden rush of cool, clean air was a shock. She unstrapped herself, her body aching, a deep purple bruise already forming on her shoulder where she'd been thrown against the cockpit wall. She climbed down the ladder and set her feet on solid ground, the world swaying slightly beneath her. Colonel Thorne was there, waiting at the bottom of the ladder. His face was a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Fury at her insubordination, awe at her skill, and a profound, world-altering respect. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could he possibly say? Before he could find his voice, a black staff car with 2 stars on the bumper screeched to a halt nearby. The rear door opened and out stepped General Madsen, the sector commander, who had been on base for a high-level inspection and had witnessed the entire impossible event from the TOC. Madsen was a man from the old school, a pilot himself who had flown in 3 wars. He walked with a purpose that parted the crowd of firefighters and medics. He strode right past Colonel Thorne, his eyes locked on Eva. He didn't look at her face, not at first. His gaze was fixed on the small, frayed patch on her left sleeve. The black, stylized owl with silver eyes. The general stopped dead in his tracks. His breath caught in his throat. He reached out a trembling hand, his finger hovering over the patch as if it were a holy relic. "The night witches," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that stunned everyone present. "My God, I haven't seen that patch since the Skunk Works days, since General Rostova." He finally lifted his gaze to meet Eva's. He saw the same gray eyes, the same unbreakable calm he remembered from 20 years ago. "You're his daughter," he said. It wasn't a question. Colonel Thorne's jaw literally dropped. He looked from the general to the patch, to the battered, alien-looking aircraft, and then back to the quiet, unassuming ferry pilot. The pieces clicked into place with the force of a thunderclap. Rostova, the Strix. It wasn't a failed prototype. It was a legacy. "Your father," the general continued, his voice now for the whole tarmac to hear, "was a legend. He led the 77th Special Operations Aviation Unit. The Night Witches, a black project. They flew these things when they were still classified above top secret. They wrote the book on low-altitude, zero-visibility infiltration. He saved my ass over the Balkans in one of these," he gestured to the Strix. "The official record says you're a ferry pilot, Captain. But your father never ferried anything in his life. He taught you, didn't he? He taught you how to fly the storm." Eva simply nodded, her expression unchanging. The general looked at Thorne, his eyes hard as diamonds. "Colonel, this officer just saved your entire Spectre team with a skill set you couldn't possibly comprehend. Her real file is likely so classified you wouldn't be able to open it if you tried. The call sign Nix, that was her father's. It seems he passed it down." He turned back to Eva and rendered a slow, perfect salute. An old warrior recognizing one of his own. The sun was setting, painting the bruised sky in hues of orange and purple. The chaos of the return had subsided, replaced by the quiet efficiency of the ground crews. The Strix had been towed back to Hangar 7, where it sat under the lights, its wounds stark and visible. Deep gouges scarred its belly, the port engine was a blackened mess of wires and twisted metal, and the entire airframe was coated in a film of sand that dulled its radar-absorbent skin. It looked exhausted. Eva was there, still in her flight suit. She had refused medical attention, accepting only a bottle of water. She stood before the aircraft, her helmet resting on a nearby crate, her presence as silent and watchful as the machine itself. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a deep, resonant ache in her bones and a profound weariness. The hangar doors were open, letting in the cooling evening breeze. The wind, now gentle, carried the distant sounds of the base, but inside the hangar, a pocket of stillness had formed around the pilot and her plane. She ran a gloved hand over the deep scratch left by the canyon wall. The metal was still warm, a faint vibration humming deep within its structure, the ghost of the engines. She could feel the memory of the flight in her fingertips, the shriek of the wind, the jolt of the impact, the crushing G-forces of the canyon turn. Airman Vance approached quietly, holding a diagnostic tablet. He moved with a new kind of deference, his youthful bravado replaced by a quiet, earnest respect. He stopped a few feet away, not wanting to intrude on her communion. "They're putting a full team on her, ma'am," he said, his voice low. "Top priority." General Matson himself signed the order. "Unlimited budget. They're flying in specialists from Groom Lake. Said they're pulling the original schematics out of the archives." Eva nodded, her eyes still on the scar. "She'll need it." "Colonel Thorne updated your file," Vance added, looking at his tablet. "Your status has been changed. From transient to operational command." He paused. He wanted me to tell you that Vance struggled for the words. "He said he's never been happier to be proven wrong in his entire career." Eva's lips curved in a faint, fleeting smile. It was the first sign of emotion she had shown all day. It wasn't a smile of triumph or vindication, but of a quiet, weary satisfaction. The institutional reversal was complete, not with a parade or a medal ceremony, but with a quiet update to a digital file and a second-hand apology delivered by a young airman in a dusty hangar. It was more than enough. She looked at Vance, truly seeing the young man whose faith in her and her machine had never wavered. "You did good work prepping her, Leo," she said, using his first name. "The power couplings held firm on ignition. That was your work." Vance flushed with pride, standing a little taller. "Just doing my job, ma'am," he hesitated, then added, "That was one hell of a flight, ma'am. One hell of a flight." Eva turned her gaze back to the Strix. The setting sun cast a long shadow from the aircraft, a dark, winged shape that stretched across the hangar floor. In the gathering twilight, with the wind whispering around its battered frame, it looked less like a machine and more like a slumbering mythological beast. The owl on her patch, Nyx, was the Greek goddess of the night, a primordial figure who even Zeus feared. It was a fitting name for her father, and for the incredible machine of which they were both a part. The dust of the haboob was settling, both outside and within the rigid command structure of the base. Her dignity, like the Strix, remained scarred, tested, but unbroken. And in the silence there was respect.